Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Arun Seraphin, who is the Deputy Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association. Arun Seraphin, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Likewise. The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Arun, will cover your recent experiences with the Senate Arms Services Committee and the way the SASC engages with emerging technology. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Well, I think that we're at a moment in time for the government, for the country, for the Pentagon, where we really need to consider how quickly the national security landscape is changing, and then what kind of steps we need to take to position ourselves correctly in that new landscape. Current events in Ukraine made people think a little bit about, have we been maybe focusing too much on the Pacific theater in competition with China? And do we need to remember that there are other parts of the world and there are other styles of military conflict or confrontation with adversary nations? And I think the other thing is that though everyone in Washington talks about it, I don't think anyone really grasps how fast technology is moving, both the speed at which technologies we know about are moving from lab to clever product to fielded weapon system sometimes, or military capability. And then the other side of it is not just those things that are moving faster, but those things that are appearing all the time, new technologies, new scientific breakthroughs. And so that landscape is so different than the landscape we were in just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think the major assessment I have is that we don't know what the landscape is, and we aren't quite positioned to deal with a dynamically changing landscape.
Yeah, that seems like a really appropriate take. So could we start talking a little bit about your experience on the Hill? And it might be helpful for some in our audience to understand what the difference is between the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. Do you think you could take a beat on that to give our audience a little 101?
Sure. The Senate Armed Services Committee is one of the standing committees of the Senate. It actually dates back in one form or the other all the way back to almost the beginnings of the United States Senate in various names. I think it's got its current form since around World War II-ish, is maybe slightly before, is when the official Senate Armed Services Committee was established. And its job is to do oversight over the military affairs of the government, primarily the Department of Defense. The major product that the Armed Services Committee produces is a single bill each year called the National Defense Authorization Act. In addition to that, the committee's job is to do oversight over the Pentagon and its programs, as well as to authorize the budget of the Pentagon each year. And I worked on that Senate Armed Services Committee staff for about 20 years. One of our partner committees is the one you mentioned, the House Armed Services Committee. They have very similar role to the Senate Armed Services Committee with slight differences on the edges. But again, their jobs are basically the same: help produce a National Defense Authorization Act, perform the oversight over the Pentagon. The other major partners that people may have heard of are the appropriations committees. So there's a House Appropriation Committee, Subcommittee on Defense. There's a Senate Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Defense. They have similar beats to the Senate Armed Services and House Armed Services Committee. The difference is that those appropriations committees spend a little less time on the policy issues that the Armed Services Committees think about and more on the budgetary issues, because in the end, it's the appropriations committees who pass the appropriations bills, which become appropriations laws, and those are the actual budgets that the federal agencies, including the Pentagon, operate under. So those appropriations committees are really the place to go when you're trying to figure out or adjust or understand the budgeting for the Pentagon. And so that's kind of the way these different committees sort of play their different roles.
Presumably, there are many committees that are part of both the House and Senate, but like committees for agriculture, for food and drug, for health and human services. Are there just committees all over the place for all kinds of government functions?
Right. So in the Senate, there's going to be, I don't know, I want to say tens of committees, like committees that people have heard of: Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, Senate Commerce Committee, Senate Finance Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee, lots of different committees. They each have their own jurisdictions. So Senate Judiciary Committee, you see on TV all the time, confirming judges, Supreme Court justices, and that sort of thing. Senate Finance Committee thinks about tax policy. Homeland Security Committee thinks about Homeland Security, and on and on and on. The various committees have their own jurisdictions, but there's always a lot of overlap. So when you think about a major bill, for example, going through the Congress these days, thinks about competition with China, economic and national security competition with China. That's such a big issue that touches everything from the military to economic competitiveness to policies on immigration to everything, that all of the committees contribute to those kinds of bills. So as a staffer on the Hill, you work with those other committee staffers, especially in those areas of overlap. So me, as someone who handled science policy and science and technology policy for the Armed Services Committee, there would be some cross-cutting issues. So think about an issue like, how should the federal government as a whole be investing in a new technology like quantum science? Well, that's something that you can't just do in DoD alone. You should do it with DoD and Energy and National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, which meant that a whole set of staffers from all of these various committees had to get together, compare notes, and maybe even craft legislation together. The other thing that connects these different committees is that the actual senators are serving on multiple committees. So I work for the last 6 years of my career in the Senate for Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island. He had assignments on the Armed Services Committee, where he was the chairman, but he was also a member of the Appropriations Committee and the Banking Committee, amongst other things. And so, he was working across those committees as well, just because of his committee assignments. And so that creates more connectivity between different committees.
This podcast is not a political podcast, but it's hard to sometimes not brush up against political topics during these kinds of discussions. And here we are talking about the Senate and the House of Representatives. There's a lot of politics going on in those bodies. I guess the question I want to ask you, and not a political question, but more of an objective question, is, in your experience, how does politics bear down on your activities as a Senate staff member? And like when there are political shufflings, like for example, we've got elections coming up in November of 2022. There could be, like, the Senate or the House could quote unquote flip to a different majority. How do those dynamics affect people doing your job?
So for a committee staffer, for nearly every committee, I think I want to say every committee, you are either a Democratic staffer or a Republican staffer working for a single member of the Senate, who's either the chairman or the ranking member of that committee, depending on which party is in charge at that moment. And you are a government employee, but you are serving at the will of that member of Congress, that chairman of the committee. Now, the way that the committee staffs are divided up is it's whichever party is in the majority tends to get more funding for its staff, or the budget for its staff. And so they also have a responsibility to do more of the administrative work on running the committee and holding the hearings. And so the majority party will have larger budgets and therefore larger staffs as well. And so what happens when an election changes control of the Senate, so let's say upcoming election, the Democrats who are in the majority suddenly go into the minority and the Republicans take over the majority, you will see on the committee staffs a changing in the number of Democratic staff versus Republican staff. So those Democratic staffs will typically shrink and the Republican staffs will typically grow. And so the staffers, it's part of your career, it's part of your life that you deal with those changes in majority and minority. And so I have seen people lose their jobs because of an election that didn't go the way that they wanted. And I've seen lots of people get hired when an election goes the way it wanted. I, fortunately for myself, got to start working on the Armed Services Committee in 2001 and left there in the end in 2022 and saw many changes between majority and minority over those years. And fortunately for me, I never lost my job in any of them, but my title changed. So one day I was a majority staffer, the next day I was a minority staffer. And then just because of the quirk of the Armed Services Committee, I packed up all my boxes from my cubicle and moved about 20 yards to one side or the other to the other cubicle.
Oh, is that right?
And unpacked my boxes. And then a couple of years later, if we won the majority again, I packed up all my boxes and moved back to the other side of the suite. So, so the politics are there in terms of your employment. The other thing about it is the politics are there in terms of the Senate is a political place. It's, it's like I just said, the majority is decided by who got more votes and who has more senators, and that shapes some of the agenda. But the way that the Senate has to work to function is typically, the way the rules of the Senate are. Most things you're going to need, this is very complicated, and I'll just breeze over it a little bit.
Sure,
Most things you're going to need 60 votes, which means you're going to have some kind of bipartisan consensus to pass something. And if you can't work in an area or come up with things that are going to create that bipartisan consensus, it's going to be hard for you to get anything done with such an evenly divided Senate. So, fortunately, again, for me, I worked and stayed working in a place, the Armed Services Committee, which is the most bipartisan place, we would argue, on Capitol Hill. The appropriations committees might argue with us, but we think we were the most bipartisan place on Capitol Hill. Just that idea that I told you that we all sat in the same suite, shared the same kitchen, swapped desks every time an election changed things around, kind of shows you it was a bipartisan place. I took meetings with my Republican counterparts on a daily basis. I was working with them all year. And one of the things that made the Armed Services Committee such a great place to work was that it was so sort of immune to the politics of the day. We kind of felt like we had a job, which was produce our bill, do that oversight. We had important customers, which were namely the warfighters and the taxpayers. And we owed it to them to cut through the politics and do our jobs. And it became a place where if you really wanted to work in a bipartisan fashion, you came there. And I stayed for 20 years because it was such a great place to work. And in fact, if you came in there and tried to be more of a, let's say, call it a partisan warrior, it wouldn't really work that well for you. It would not be the environment for you. And so I think you'd find on those defense committees, appropriations defense committees, House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, you find them to be very bipartisan places.
Gotcha. Let's start wading into emerging tech. How does the Hill think about and evaluate emerging technology?
So, one of the challenges on Capitol Hill is this ability to sort of keep up with technology. And that stems from the fact, partially, that the members of Congress, for the most part, don't have technical backgrounds. There's very few of them that have been working scientists and engineers. There's a few, there's always a couple, There's very few of them that have been technology entrepreneurs. There's a few. They're hitting it here and there, it's similar on the staff side. There's really not that many staff with deep technical backgrounds. It turns out I have a PhD in nanotechnology from MIT, and found my way to Capitol Hill through a fellowship program that allows scientists and engineers to come try out the Hill for a year. I liked it enough, I stayed for 20. But there is a shortage of technical people on the Hill who can absorb technology issues and help the members of Congress understand them. And this is really, really important these days, because every day, more and more, the senators and the congressmen are thinking about technical issues. They're thinking about what are those emerging technologies? How much should the federal government be spending on research or buying those technologies? How does the federal government regulate those emerging technologies? How does the federal government set up its own institutions to develop those kinds of things, like a laboratory network? And so all of those issues get very technical. And so the Hill needs to find ways of evaluating those and thinking about those technologies. And so one is to depend on the staff. Second is we had on the Hill, we had friends in places like the Congressional Research Service and the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, who had technical capabilities and could support the members of Congress and the committee staff on research activities, writing reports, doing analysis. Plus, one of the great things about working on Capitol Hill is that you could pretty much call in any expertise you wanted to, whether it was calling in experts from the federal agencies. So I could bring in people from the Naval Research Lab or DARPA or any office in the Pentagon to come and talk to me about technologies or their programs. You also had great access to industry and academia. People always wanted to come in and talk to us about what they were working on. And you could also then use those connections to ask them about policy things you were thinking about. And then there's a huge think tank community that's constantly trying to feed Capitol Hill ideas on policies, ideas about emerging technologies, things like the National Academies of Sciences or all of the various think tanks in DC. I had great access to them. I had great access to their reports. I had great access to their experts. And so that's how I could sort of absorb to the best of my ability what was going on in emerging technologies and then make policy recommendations around them.
Wow. Yeah. So many things come to mind. One of the persistent themes on this podcast related to information operations and cognitive security and how we, the West, can manage this problem or get ahead of the problem is talent. And when you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is like a talent shortage of people who are conversant or able of to understand and orient on what's happening and serving it up to decision makers and people who are writing checks in a way that is appropriate.
Yeah, so that we need lots of different kinds of people with lots of different talents, and so you certainly need in the science and technology world those people who just love to be in the lab and love to experiment and can spend decades or their whole career working on something that you and I will never understand, but is super important deep in the bowels of chemistry or cognitive science or whatever it is. And then you need those people who can bridge between that technical community and other communities, right? And so, I'm a material scientist, and we always talked about how the coolest things happened at the interfaces. And so I've been fortunate to have a career at the interface between science and technology and the military, science and technology and policy, science and technology and politics. And I feel like, the place where I've contributed is not so much that I wrote great technical papers. I wrote some, none of them were great. I never became a professor, never ran a research lab. I served in that bridging function. So trying to tell people who either fund science and technology, regulate science and technology, or try to staff up those institutions, run those institutions that do science and technology work, or even those people who use science and technology. They think about a cyber operator, right? Or someone who works in chem bio defense, right? those are technical jobs, but they're operational jobs, right? So I feel like me and a whole bunch of other people sit between the scientific community and those kinds of communities, operators and regulators and funders and lawmakers, and to perform that translation function. And so what do you need to do? You have to be smart enough to be and knowledgeable enough to be dangerous, and conversant on both sides of that equation. You need to have good, old people would call them Rolodexes on both sides, the sort of eye on Capitol Hill. No matter what you ask me about, I could find my way to a few experts very quickly. And then I need to have a sense of understanding what they were saying and being able to filter for their biases. And then I need to have the skill set to turn that into useful information to whoever was my customer at that time, whether it was a senator or whether it was somebody I was working for in the White House or whoever it was. And so we need people in all of these places.
Yeah.
You know, we absolutely need those people who are going to work in the lab and create those innovations and work in industry and create those innovations. But then, especially in Washington, we also need those people who are willing to work at that interface.
Right, right. Well, so how does the SASC or the technology interfaces such as yourself, how do you serve up material to the members of the committee? So back up for just a second. So my understanding in the intelligence community, our intelligence agencies go out and collect intelligence, and then but they try to just serve up facts to the decision makers. These are the facts, or they maybe have some sort of a scale on the facts, like these are facts that we're certain of, these we're less certain of. There's some kind of, somehow they have like a racking and stacking mechanism to serve up to people who are analyzing it so that they produce insights that are worth something. How does the SASC, or how do people in your role go about providing briefs or products to members of the committee?
So it depends on the people you're working for at that moment. So I've worked for senators and people in the Defense Department and people in the White House. And as a staffer, you sort of, and this is true of any staffer in any job anywhere, you sort of figure out what your boss is like, what they can consume in terms of information, what kind of learner they are, and you tailor your products in that way. So sitting in the Armed Services Committee, our members would have had access to all of those kinds of intelligence documents you're talking about, and they could consume the same products that intelligence officials in the intelligence agencies were consuming, if they chose to consume them that way, written products or briefings or whatever. They would have access to formal reporting by the rest of the Pentagon, paper products or briefings, GAO reports, and all. I would say most members of Congress, because of the time constraints on them, this is true for most White House officials and most Department of Defense officials, don't have the time to consume the really incredibly well-written 200-page report on anything. So you do get a lot of people reading executive summaries or staff-written summaries of larger documents. And I think most of these folks at the higher levels honestly consume better information through conversations with people. And so part of your function was to select the right people to come and talk to the senior officials, whether that was a senator or other person, and work with that person to get them to deliver the information that the senior official needed in a way they could consume it. And so, in my space, I was sometimes dealing with very technical topics, and some senators who didn't know a lot about those technical topics. And so it was sometimes a lot of effort, honestly, a lot of fun to find those right messengers and to get them to deliver the appropriate message. And you as a staffer are not trying to bias the system too much one way or the other. You're not the decision maker. The senator is the decision maker, and you want to lay out the facts in a way that they can understand and let them make a decision about things like, should we fund A or B? Should we dial up or down the funding, or A or B? Should we increase the regulation on this Pentagon activity? Should we decrease the regulation on this Pentagon activity? And so you need to present enough to them to let them make a decision. And then typically as a staffer, you're often asked to make a recommendation. And you make your best recommendation, understanding the issue, understanding the policy, and honestly, understanding the politics of it as well.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story along those lines of, wanting to or needing to communicate some sort of a technology, and it was hard? I'll tell a story on myself first. Like, I don't know how old Twitter is, 2008 or something like that. But like when Twitter first came around, I'm only in my early 50s, and so this was whatever 12, 14 years ago, and so I'm a relatively young guy. I didn't get Twitter. I still kind of don't get Twitter. I'm not a big Twitter user, but anyway. Do you have any kind of like a story of you had to crack a nut on figuring out how to communicate something to somebody? Anything like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you run into this sometimes where, honestly, the thing to do is all you're trying to do is let the senators not be afraid of the technology, right? And make it digestible enough and engaging enough that they want to hear about it and think about it. And so it can't be scary to the point that they tune out, or complicated to the point that they tune out, because you do need them actively engaged to make a funding decision or regulatory decision. And so these days, honestly, one of the ones that we struggle with a lot is something like quantum science, right? Which is just so not based in physical intuition. It's so not based in the way that you perceive the world, that it gets really hard to explain, even to technical people who aren't in that field, how this stuff is working. And so, it takes a lot of work to sort of find those people who can make quantum computing accessible, who can make quantum entanglement accessible. And so if you can do that, then you get this enthusiasm from the senators, because they get enough of the technology and the science that they get it. Something interesting is happening here, and it could lead to that. And then they understand their role in it, because most senators will understand, I don't need to solve those equations that you're telling me exist. I need to understand the policy environment that science is going to live in. And you've explained to me what it does and what it could do. I got a glimpse of how it works. Now I understand why we need to have strong and stable funding for that area for a long time. Now I understand why we need to have good laboratories and good people and good policies, good regulatory environment to let that technology mature. But you, with almost 0 times do you need to drag them into ever showing them an equation or anything like that, right? So, I've had people do fantastically well, sort of explaining to a senator about a technology at sort of the undergraduate science level, and that's plenty. That's all they need to know. Because they need to move on to the issues that they can actually control, which are those policy issues, those funding issues. And so over the years, it's been great, working with the senators are very, very smart people who just happen to not be good at solving differential equations. But they are smart enough to sort of grasp, and I've been here long enough that I've seen them grasp nanotechnology and cognitive neural networks and fuel cells and quantum and MEMS and whatever. It's been a one after another over the years, and they've done as well as they've done in trying to understand and shape that policy environment.
I'd like to ask you, Arun, about your perspective on what are the challenges that we face in having a Department of Defense with the relevant technology to address today's competitive environment.
So I think from the Pentagon's perspective, in trying to keep up with rapidly changing technologies, I think there's two I would say two things that makes it really hard. One is the speed at which these technologies are moving requires you to have ever-changing staff who are experts in those technologies and how to buy them and how to monitor them. And on the intelligence side, how to analyze and evaluate capabilities of threats that might be emerging because of these technologies. And the Pentagon is a government institution, and it is hard to hire and dynamically shape your workforce in the government, which means it is very difficult then to keep up with ever-changing technologies, which are moving at the speed of commercial advancements of technologies. And so the people side for the Pentagon is always going to be difficult, and they're always going to be sort of a day late, a dollar short on having the right people in place in the right places to either be the smart evaluator of the technology, smart intelligence analyst, smart buyer, even smart developer of a technology. The other thing is, all of these advances in science and technology eventually have to find their way into useful operational capabilities for the military or the intelligence community, which means at some point you have to procure something, either a product or a service based on that emerging science or tech. And the government's procurement process is not designed to be fast. It's more designed to be safe, right? To ensure that the taxpayer is not getting ripped off, to ensure that you are getting what you paid for at a fair price. And the problem is the Pentagon's generally buying outside the market. And so the natural constraints that a market creates for you and ensuring some sort of price control and competition just don't exist. And so we compensate for that in this weird place where DoD is the only buyer by creating rules to sort of make sure we're not getting ripped off, that we can sort of regulate the sellers, evaluate the sellers. All of those things are good to make sure we don't really waste money, do really dumb things, but they tend to slow down the system. And so slowing down the system for safety's sake means you're not keeping up with emerging technologies as fast as they're moving, which then leads to not actually operationalizing those technologies you want on the pace you want. And so those are the biggest challenges, is can we get people in place to evaluate the technologies and buy them? Can we move our money? Can we move our processes fast enough to keep up with the technology? On the congressional side, it's kind of going to be similar, right? We talked about the lack of technical capability on the Hill. And so therefore, new technologies are going to appear. The technologists are going to understand them more quickly than anyone else, and they're going to appear in the marketplace and in the public faster than the policymakers are ready to respond to them. And so things like stem cell research, cloning, are going to get out there faster and turn into commercial products and services before the regulatory community is ready to deal with it. And so, you're always going to be chasing after these technologies just because it's so difficult for the policy community to keep up with it because of workforce issues, because of information flow, and because of the speed of the legislative process, which is also designed to have a moderate speed because
right.
it's a democratic process.
Right? That's a feature, actually.
It's a feature, right. But you don't do as many things on the innovation side in the commercial sector by committee like we do in the government. And that's probably good on the commercial innovation side, but it's also probably good to do things by committee when you're making public policy for a whole nation. And so those are things that are naturally going to move at different speeds. So I would say, that's the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you a question about your expertise, nano technology. Could you just give like a quick beat on, oh shucks, I don't know, like what is the coolest thing that you can talk about relative to nanotechnology and the kinds of things that are that we can expect either in DoD or in the marketplace that uses nanotechnology?
So, I mean, it turns out nanotechnology has a bit of a bad reputation as sort of a technology that didn't work out. I mean, I got my degree in this field in the 90s, and it was relatively new, at least name, for a field back then. But scientists had been working at the nano scale, which is 1,000 times smaller than the micro scale, for a long time before the 90s. And if you know what you're looking for and poke at it a little bit, you'll find that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry now, nanotechnology. It's in lots of the materials that you're using on a daily basis. It's in things like glasses. It's certainly in things like chemical processing. It's in certainly things like storage, magnetic storage for computers and other, certainly in nanotechnologies all over your electronics, for even your handheld devices, your iPhone and such. And, some of the more exotic capabilities, like having systems that can change color based on the kind of light or heat they're experiencing and using them for sensors. Systems that can turn on and off switches at incredible fast speeds, depending on how much light or electricity is going through them. Those are commonly used all over the place now. And so, nanotechnology went through the traditional hype cycle of every technology, and it was very exciting, cover of Time magazine kind of stuff at the beginning. Made when we were working on the National Nanotechnology Initiative in the late 90s, even made State of the Union address, right? President Clinton talked about Library of Congress on a thing the size of a sugar cube, right? And then it got funded a lot, and then it sort of disappeared. And all of the people who thought that something giant was going to happen would claim nothing happened. But on the other hand, you could say that's the way it's supposed to work, right? There was a lot of enthusiasm. The federal government invested a lot of research dollars into it. We created a community, which created some industries. And then the technology naturally found its way into products, both on the military side and on the commercial side. And, we need to understand that when we think about emerging tech these days, things like artificial intelligence, things like quantum computing, quantum sensing, that there's going to be a lot of hype, there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm, and at first there's going to be a lot of money, but these things take time to mature and find their way into industry and find their way into products. And if you stick with it, which is, like we said before, stable funding, good regulatory environment, right kinds of government and private sector institutions, you can make these things move through. So, I would call nanotechnology both a public sector and a private sector success story over the years.
Cool. So you're with the Emerging Technologies Institute at NDIA. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there and what attracted you to that after your long career in government?
Yeah, sure. So NDIA is the National Defense Industrial Association. So it's the largest defense trade association in the world. NDIA has 1,800 member companies and roughly 30 divisions, technical divisions in things like manufacturing and cybersecurity, undersea warfare, lots of different kinds of divisions. It's got chapters all over the country, and NDIA maybe is most famous for running large conferences, events all over the country. So last week I was in Tampa, Florida at the large Special Operations Forces Industry Conference down with Special Operations Command headquarters down there. And so NDIA has been happily in existence for over 100 years. And in the last year or so decided to try to stand up the Emerging Technologies Institute, which is at the basic level a think tank, a technology think tank. And would create sort of the same kinds of products that most technology think tanks will produce, deep dive research papers to informational events like webinars and panels, to content at those conferences, speakers on science and technology, emerging technologies issues. The difference between ETI, I think, and most other think tanks in town is the fact that we are part of NDIA. So we're the think tank that actually can tap into 1,800 industry members and all their employees to include all 10 of the big defense contractors, 50 plus universities, lots of small and medium-sized defense companies, and some large commercial companies who happen to be members of some very famous commercial companies who are members of NDIA as well. And so our ability to tap into that set of companies and their people to help us decide what kinds of technology areas to look at and to get them to help us with our working groups to develop those reports, to develop those panels, develop that kind of content is unique. The fact that we're part of NDIA, an industry consortium like we are, means the Pentagon and the government as a whole views this as sort of a safe place to come and talk to. The lawyers really get mad at you if you talk to individual companies or individual universities, but if you're in the government and you talk to an industry association, it's kind of a safer place to be. And so we can, if you want to talk about the future of microelectronics and you're a government official, we can gather industry experts and university experts on both sides of whatever question you want. You can speak to that whole group. You can do it closed. You can do it open. We can produce the outcomes of that discussion or not, right? And so it's kind of a unique place to convene because we sit at that intersection of industry, university, and government. So, I left Capitol Hill after 20 years. I was looking for some place to keep thinking about the same kinds of technology policy issues that I've been thinking about, and didn't really want to become a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. And so NDIA came to me with this offer of help us stand up this think tank, help shape the agenda. What kind of technology should we be thinking about? And you're kind of in that safe space that I talked about, where you can be a policymaker, a kind of a neutral policymaker, and you can tell the truth about policies and technologies. And so that all appealed to me, and then that's why I'm trying this. And so, if you think about the kinds of things we're thinking about right now, I'll give you an example. Some members of our team are working on a supply chain study. And so the premise is this: we picked out 4 areas that we're most interested in. One is hypersonics, one is directed energy, one is quantum sensing, and one is biomaterials, bioengineered materials. And the supply chain study, there's lots of supply chain studies going on all over the place. Ours is different in the sense that we're saying, project yourself out into the future, 10 plus years, where DoD, the Department of Defense industry, is making use of these technologies. What do you think the supply chain needs to look like in that future? And what steps do we need to take today to ensure we have that robust supply chain in the future? And so this requires you to think about the systems, the future systems in hypersonics and directed energy, what's going to go into those systems, and then what kind of supply chain are you going to need? And is that going to need to be a US only supply chain? Does it need to be a global supply chain? What kind of security do we need to put on that supply chain? What kind of workforce do we need for that supply chain? And then give advice, the theory is give advice to the government on how to ensure we're in that space when we're actually using these systems on an operational daily basis. What you don't want to end up in is maybe the world we're in today with rare earth materials or microelectronics, where the supply chain is so uncertain, it's affecting everyone's daily lives, including the military. And so is there anything you could do stepping forward into the future to sort of avoid some of that? So that's kind of a fun deep dive project. The other end of the spectrum, this week we're in every couple of weeks, we're doing Technology 101 speakers for the general NDIA membership. So it turns out not everyone in NDIA works, let's say, in cloud computing. They've all heard about cloud computing. They may use cloud computing, but they don't know what it is. It's kind of like talking to my senators. So we find experts in those technical areas, and we give you over like a virtual brown bag lunch, Technology 101 in cloud computing to show you it doesn't actually occur in the clouds, right? It's just this kind of computing. And so those have been, it's so far well received, right? People have heard about cloud, they've heard about hypersonics, they don't know a lot about it, and we teach you a little bit about it. And so, from the deep dive technical study to that kind of 101 and sort of everything in between, it's been fun to sort of figure out what to work on and develop those kinds of informational products and services.
Excellent. You're continuing your connector role.
Exactly. Exactly.
Along those lines, last question. What is your personal diet of news and information to help you in your connector role? I mean, are you do you listen to podcasts, cable news? Do you read journals? How do you generally get your information?
So I actually consume information best through talking to people in briefings. So ending up at NDIA and having access to their ongoing meetings and their conferences, hearing the briefings of industry members and university members and the government people talking about their programs is a good way of figuring out what's going on sort of Washington technology. In terms of absorbing what's going on in sort of emerging technologies, I've over the years set up different ways to do library searches based on keywords and have people feed me short articles. And so all you can consume is 1 or 2 pages at a time. And so I honestly at least start by working off of short press articles of various technical areas, and then I will deep dive when I need to. And Washington's filled with reports on everything. And so if you really want to go deep into something, quantum, anything, whether it's on the policy side or the technical side, you can get it. Now, I would say I'm older in my early 50s, maybe differently than you. So I would say I don't have the patience or time anymore to read this 75-page treatise on quantum whatever. And so I live off of those shorter things in those conversations until you really need to deep dive. And then you can find it and go deeper on it.
Arun, Seraphin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks. It was fun. I really appreciate the time.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.